I also say to students many times that we all have to learn to be open to failure and to recognize its value. As a person who's failed many times in life, I've had a lot of experience with that. Former president, of course, Simon Schwartz, said to me, "Oh, Dean Valentini, we never use the word failure, we use the word pivot." Could you comment on that?
So I think you have to just embrace failure as a learning opportunity. If you aren't failing, you aren't sort of swinging hard enough, you aren't trying to go big enough, you aren't trying to go fast enough, and it's just learning about the contours of what's possible. And I think that's exactly right. You sort of run into a wall and then you turn 90 degrees and walk the other way. And that is something that you just have to get excited about. The people I see who burn out sort of building companies or sort of being inside of startups is because they get obsessed with the product they are building rather than the process of building it or the sort of impact that is having. You have to have something that's sort of everlasting, sustain you. Otherwise, you're going to get bored and want to move on.
So one can find inspirational posters and read lots of places the phrase "culture is everything." What is the culture at Thumbtack, and how do you build a culture, starting with you and a partner, and how do you maintain it as an enterprise grows?
Yeah, I strongly agree with that statement. So first off, you have to define what culture is. In my mind, there are two broad aspects of it. The first is values. The things that help orient people to help them make decisions and make trade-offs. And the second thing are habits, how you bring those values to life. The stark difference between the two is that the values should stay the same, even as the company grows and evolves, while the habits have to change, because what's right for 10 people is going to be wrong for 100. And so the question then is, like, how do you set those values? I would argue that culture is an emergent phenomenon from the sort of self-selection that brings together the first 5, 10, 15 people. And it is not early on an engineered thing. It is simply an outcome of these random people, not random, but something that brought these people together that you actually probably aren't self-aware of. So the first thing we did in sort of helping codify our culture was to look inside of us and say, hey, what do we think is unique? Not necessarily good or better than others, just simply differentiating about us. What do we like about us? And what do we want to sort of put on a pedestal and celebrate and support going forward? And we did that as a team of maybe 30, 35 at the time. I think the first time we really codified it. And then later in our history, at this point we're probably 100 or 150 people, we said, all right, let's revisit these values and think not just about what brought us here, but what do we need to sort of get to where we want to go. And at that point, 5 years, 6 years into it, it became much more of an engineered thing. And for us, those values there's 4 of them. First one is know your customer. At the end of the day, we're in the business of serving our customers, and they're the boss. So in our org chart, I'm at the bottom and they're at the top. And what we celebrate is learning about them so that we can serve them. The second one is reason from first principles, which is all about applying the scientific method to figure out our own way forward, our path, our map. The third one is make each other better. And that's all about the fact that startups are hard. And the odds are stacked against you. And so the only way that you have a shot of success is if you work to bring the best out of every individual and team and the company as a whole. And that takes work, and you have to sort of support that. And then the last one is go, where we have limited time, limited money, and we got to make the most of it, which is actually less about hours and much more about saying no to mediocre ideas or even good ideas so that you can save your time and effort for the great ideas. I think that is really where leverage comes from. So we look to find people who I think many of whom would be in this audience today, because I think Columbia attracts a similar type of person who are curious, who are team motivated and team success motivated rather than ego motivated, who are ambitious, and we have sort of a whole process to evaluate people on this front, and I think it's one of the things that has sustained us for as long as we had and supported our success.
So Ben Horowitz, who's another Columbia College grad and a university trustee, wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Hard Thing About Hard Things. And in it, one of the things he talks about as being among the really hard things is hiring people who aren't exactly like you. So at the same time, one's trying to maintain a culture, but you don't want to have everyone be exactly the same. How does one balance that?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And I think first off, you got to remember you're not hiring friends. You're not like looking for people to hang out with. I actually don't like the test of like, would I want to hang out with this person on a Sunday? It's like, no. Sundays are for family and friends. This person may not be in that club. They're about a colleague. And so I think what you have to look for is specific outputs, a talent, skill, attribute, characteristic, however you want to call it, that you think is necessary for being successful at the company, and then ignoring their background, their specific history that may have brought them to you. Because at the end of the day, if they have those output characteristics, you found the right person. Doesn't matter what path they may have been on to get from here to there, and it need not matter if they look like you or sound like you or maybe would even be the person you'd hang out with on a weekend. You have to, I think the only way to really eliminate bias from the hiring process is by being very explicit about what you're looking for and standardizing the evaluation process to try and really get at that in a as objective as possible way, knowing that, obviously it is not a totally objective process.
So I'm going to ask this question, though I think you've already answered it, and I'll give you an opportunity to elaborate it in terms of a particular word. So I talk to students a lot about empathy being one of the most important attributes and attitudes one can have, empathy being different from sympathy, empathy meaning understanding other people. Am I emphasizing that right?
I think so. I think that's exactly right. And the distinction I usually make, which is similar to yours, is intellectual versus emotional empathy. Emotional empathy is often what causes you to feel for somebody and is the sort of that cause of sympathy. You can put yourself in their shoes and then you're like, oh my God, they're suffering or they're happy, and you feel for them. That is useful, but not actually the important part of it. I think the intellectual empathy is the important part, where you can put yourself in the shoes of another to reason about what they would want or what they would need. And it's often talked about a necessary component for sort of customer development and thinking about them, but I actually think it's even more important as a manager. At the end of the day, a manager needs to be good at two things. One is predicting how people are going to react to something, and then being proactive about ensuring that that doesn't cause problems. And the first one is all about empathy. It's like, I know the dean really likes to hear about such changes before they get announced to everybody. Let's make sure he gets that email first. And it's just putting yourself in the shoes of everybody and walking down the list and then doing the work to help mitigate any of the concerns. So I think empathy, particularly that intellectual empathy of being able to sort of reason from their point of view, is fundamental across the board.